Good evening, and again, thank you all for coming. Like Darren said, my name is Olivia Miskowski, and I'm the Student Civic Engagement Intern here at the Institute of Politics. Events like tonight exemplify why it is so exciting to be a student at the University of Chicago right now. In the past several weeks, David Axelrod and his team at the IOP have put on a series of events that have given our university community the opportunity to delve into the issues that defined the 2012 election. Leading political practitioners are coming together at the University of Chicago to offer an up-close, full-access look at the modern world of American politics, and this evening will be no exception. Tonight, our panel of experts will discuss the topic of super PACs in the 2012 election. In the first presidential race since the Supreme Court's decision on Citizens United, political action committees like Priorities USA Action, American Crossroads, and even Stephen Colbert's Americans for a Better Tomorrow were free to independently campaign for their candidate of choice without restrictions on spending. And spend they did. Super PACs put down an estimated $629 million to support presidential candidates in the 2012 cycle. In 2008, that number was less than $31 million. Tonight, our panel will explore how the shifting role and influence of super PACs impacted the political landscape in 2012 and what the future holds for these powerful organizations. Our panel this evening is comprised of prominent leaders from the political action field. Sean Sweeney served as a senior strategist to Priorities USA Action, the super PAC that supported efforts to re-elect President Obama in 2012, and previously held the post of Chief of Staff to White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel in the Obama administration. He has previously served as the staff director to the House Democratic Caucus and as the political director for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Stephen Law is the chief executive of Crossroads GPS, one of the nation's largest and best-known super PACs. Previously, Law served as chief legal officer and general counsel of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and was deputy secretary of the U.S. Department of Labor under George W. Bush. On Capitol Hill, Law served as executive director of the National Republican Senatorial Committee for both the 1998 and 2000 cycles and was Senator Mitch McConnell's chief of staff from 1991 to 1997. Saul Shore is a veteran Democratic media consultant who most recently developed the advertising and media efforts for Priorities USA Action. He also served as a media consultant to the 2008 campaign of Barack Obama and has represented candidates for statewide office in Missouri, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, among others. Charlie Spies is an attorney and member in charge of the Washington, D.C. office of the law firm Clark Hill. Spies leads the firm's political law practice and serves as counsel to multiple super PACs, including Restore Our Future, which he co-founded to help support the election of Mitt Romney in 2012. Spies also served as chief financial officer and counsel for Romney's 2008 presidential campaign. Our moderator this evening is Professor William Howell. Professor Howell is the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the Harris School, a professor in the Department of Political Science and the college, and a co-director of the program on political institutions. He has written widely on the separation of powers issues and American political institutions, especially the presidency. He is the author of numerous books, including Thinking About the Presidency, The Primacy of Power, which is forthcoming at Princeton University Press. Please join me in giving these distinguished guests a warm University of Chicago welcome.
So it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I'm looking forward to learning a lot, frankly. These are interesting times with elections. A lot is in flux, and how we spend money, how much we spend money, how much money we spend, and to what ends. These are big open questions. And tonight we're going to be focusing on, as was mentioned earlier, super PACs, which is a new entity. And I thought to get started, it would be useful if we could just have each of our guests say a little bit about how you ended up how did you get here? So you've gotten involved in these new things called super PACs, but you all have long and distinguished careers in politics, and we'd like to just sort of hear a little bit about your backstory. And why don't we just go at the end, Saul, and kick things off.
I've been doing media since 1982, and we work for a lot of candidates running for office. We work for Democrats. We work for 8 members of the United States Senate are our clients, so we're in the business. And we worked for President Obama's campaign. We were one of the consultants that were added after he got the nomination and the first time he ran, and we were just asked this last campaign to work for his super PAC, Priorities USA, so that's how we came to that.
I would just say briefly, obviously I'd been involved in politics before at the Republican Senatorial Committee, but then I did a 6-year stint in government in the administration in the Department of Labor. And one of the things I really began to appreciate and understand was how effectively labor unions engage in political action, and in how many ways they're an auxiliary force to the Democratic Party, particularly with respect to the turnout game, sometimes with advertising and other kinds of things. And after the 2008 elections, a group of us started having discussions about this kind of institutional presence on the Democratic side that enabled them to add to what they did politically beyond the parties and candidates. Back then, MoveOn.org was still considered a significant force. It's obviously not as much as it was then, but we thought that there was real value in what the Democrats had been able to do through unions, MoveOn.org and others, in building institutional activities outside of the traditional parties and campaigns that could continue to have an impact in elections. For the most part, what we'd seen on the Republican side were kind of one-off exercises where a group would form around a particular cause or candidate, then disappear after a cycle. And so the vision was to create something that could endure for a period of time, and started talking to folks like Karl Rove and Ed Gillespie and others, and that ended up leading to us founding First American Crossroads in April of 2010, and then Crossroads GPS the next month.
Great. Did you start off as a Hill person, or were you?
Yes, that was my first thing.
Yeah. My first job was at a hospital. Actually, I've always been had always been interested in politics, but didn't have a political job from the get-go. But had tried to be involved where I could, volunteering on campaigns, et cetera. When 1994, the Republican Revolution took out a lot of members of the House and Senate, and in New York, where I was from, took out Mario Cuomo, who was our at that point had been governor for 12 years. Prior to him, Hugh Carey, a Democrat, had been governor for 8 years. So we'd had 20 years since the time of Nelson Rockefeller of Democratic governors in New York. And as these folks probably tell you the same, in a state generally, the state party is whatever the state party of the sitting governor is whatever the governor wants it to be. So after 20 years of having an incumbent governor, all of a sudden the New York State Democratic Party had virtually nothing. There wasn't even really an office. There's not a working phone line. So I, in every bit of free time I had, went to the party to spend time. And I think these folks would agree too that the great thing about politics and campaigns in particular is they're meritocracies. And if the best advice I always give is show up and don't leave. And that's basically what I did in 90s.
And be willing to do anything.
Correct.
Yes.
That's exactly right. And that you will learn from everything you do, and you have to be willing to be all hands on. That's a really important point. And that just led me to sort of the conveyor belt of 96 campaign, and then several other campaigns. And I ended up sort of randomly on the staff of then Congressman Rahm Emanuel, who was the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and that began sort of a long stint with him that went from working at the committee to working in leadership in the House after he got elected. And then when he was the sort of surprise choice to be Barack Obama's chief of staff, I went with him to the White House. And then sort of following 2010, we were paying close attention at the White House, and we post Citizens United, which I know we'll get into, which is what gave rise really to the structure of these organizations as they're constituted now. Stephen and other folks did a great job getting organized very quickly and to great effect. And I was really moved sort of by the efficiency of what they did. So that's kind of what led me to leave and then think about starting up a PAC to support the president, which is what we did a few months after leaving the White House.
Sort of piggybacking on what Sean said about involvement, when I was an undergrad at the University of Michigan, I was a teaching assistant for a political science professor who was the policy director for then Ronna Romney's campaign for U.S. Senate in Michigan. Ronna is Mitt's ex-sister-in-law, but she was running for the U.S. Senate at the same time that Mitt was running for the Senate against Ted Kennedy in Massachusetts, and that she ended up losing in the primary, but I went off to D.C., went to law school in D.C., and while she ran again the next cycle, and she was the Republican nominee, and working at that point, you integrate a little bit more with the national organizations, and I was the campaign sort of person in D.C. that was working with the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and I took that opportunity of going over there and interacting with them to get a law clerk job at the NRSC. And while I was in law school, I spent 2 years working in the counsel's office at the NRSC and used that as a platform to start doing political law work. And that ranged from working at the Federal Election Commission to working at the Republican National Committee, the Republican Governors Association, and then Governor Romney's first campaign for president. And after the 2008 campaign, everybody sort of did an evaluation of what worked and what didn't work in the campaign. And one of the ways that Governor Romney got beat badly, just in a strategic sense, was that there were some outside groups. Fair Tax, for example, was a 501c4 organization that was promoting a specific issue, fair tax, but it was really used in the state of Iowa as a surrogate for the Huckabee for President campaign. And they bussed a whole bunch of voters in to the Iowa straw poll in August. And then they also were very active in the Iowa caucuses. And watching how effectively, and remember, this is pre-Citizens United, by the way. This was in 2008. But watching how effectively an outside organization was able to help Huckabee's campaign was sort of a lesson for a lot of us who had been involved in the Romney campaign in 2008. And then we got to Citizens United, watched the 2008 elections, and then we can talk a little bit about the genesis of Restore Our Future, which we started to support Governor Romney, and by the end was the largest super PAC in history, raising and spending $152 million.
So, Sean and Charlie, you both have mentioned Citizens United. I think we should get this on the table. Charlie, what was this decision? This was 2010, arguably the most important Supreme Court ruling on how our politics is conducted since Bush v. Gore. What was the ruling? What was at stake?
I'm going to answer that, but if you'll indulge me, I also want to disagree a bit with the premise. I don't think the ruling was that critical. I think the campaign finance system you see right now is a result of BICRA, the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, otherwise known as McCain-Feingold. That was a Supreme Court decision. That was a legislative decision that was then upheld in the Supreme Court that totally changed the prioritization of where money was put in the political world. So if we can step back a bit, outside organizations have always been involved in politics. Remember the Willie Horton ads that were run in 1988? Of course, Al Gore introduced the concept of Willie Horton in the Democratic primaries, but it was then an outside group, the sort of super PAC of the day. It was a 527 organization that was independently supporting then George Herbert Walker Bush that ran those ads. So we had outside ads then, and then as you move up through the years in 2004, there was Progress for America, which was a group that was very active, along with Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, that were outside groups that spent a lot of money supporting President Bush. And then we moved and saw MoveOn.org and the George Soros funded entities that were very active on the outside. All of those with an overlay that Stephen Law is the expert on this, but an overlay of union spending and the hundreds of millions of dollars that are a consistent source of outside money supporting Democrats. All of that outside money was happening way before Citizens United. I said BICRA was more important than Citizens United because what BICRA did, the McCain-Feingold law, is you used to be able to have unlimited money going into national party committees. And so you had parties acting as probably moderating forces in elections and also consolidating resources and spending them on their candidates. BICRA said parties could no longer accept unlimited resources and said they could only accept very small amounts of money. At the time that was passed, it was challenged in the Supreme Court. Senator McConnell challenged it, and I was counsel at the RNC. We challenged it also, and we argued in our briefs that it was going to be terrible for the political system, this McCain-Feingold law, because it would push money to outside groups. It was strangling the money going into political parties and to campaigns, and instead pushing money to outside organizations that were going to be more partisan, have harsh rhetoric, and it was going to sort of taint the political process and lead to just more negative attack ads. I think that's exactly what we've seen happen. In 2008, I should say, sorry for the sort of long explanation, but after 2004, where you saw Swift Boat veterans and you saw Progress for America supporting President Bush, there were a series of investigations that called Republican donors in and had them have to explain to the Federal Election Commission what their interactions with these groups, interactions with the campaigns were. And that had a huge chilling effect on Republican donors in 2008. And of course, our Republican nominee in 2008 was John McCain, who had railed against outside groups. And so donors weren't really looking to support him with outside groups. So you didn't see much activity. As you heard in the introduction, there was very little, quote, super PAC or outside group activity. Of course, the unions were very active in 2008, but on the right, you didn't see much money. Then in 2009, you saw Citizens United. Citizens United largely, it's the US Supreme Court's decision, it largely upheld established precedent that goes back to the Buckley v. Vallejo decision, which is the seminal Supreme Court decision in the 1970s, and then you extend precedent through the 1980s. You had Colorado Republican Party, which is the Supreme Court case that says you're allowed to do independent expenditures so that individuals could spend unlimited amounts of money as long as that money was spent independently from the campaigns that they were benefiting. So you already had in the 80s an established precedent that you could spend unlimited money, but then Citizens United in 2009 said that not only could individuals, if individuals could spend money unlimited, well, individuals should be band together. It's free, be able to band together. This is First Amendment right of free association. If one person can do it, they should be able to do it with their friends and speak out and spend money independently of campaigns in the political process. That Supreme Court decision had less, I think, legal value than it had symbolic value. Symbolically, I think it freed up Republican and conservative donors who had sat on the sidelines in 2008 after being investigated with McCain as the nominee. They all of a sudden said, heck, this is, the Supreme Court is telling us this is okay. It's been validated. The Federal Election Commission put out some rules on exactly how you can do it. And stayed within the constraints of what the statutory and legal language was. And as a result, you saw groups like Stevens, American Crossroads started up as a super PAC and then a sister 501c4 organization. And then just to bring this full circle, in November 2009, we started up Restore Our Future, the first candidate-specific super PAC, and that was set up specifically to support Governor Romney. And I'm sorry, in 2010, I should have said. We started up in the fall of 2010, and we spent a year raising money. And in the political world, the fact that nobody really knew what we were doing for a long time, there were no articles until about 8 or 9 months after we'd been out raising money, was something I'm particularly proud of. And it's hard to keep a secret, but as soon as people saw what we were doing, everybody, both our Republican opponents and Democratic opponents, set up similar organizations that were candidate specific, and that led to the world we saw in 2012.
Steve, can you say just a little bit about what defines a super PAC? What are these things, and how do they differ from other funding organizations?
Well, I think they vary a great deal, as we even saw this last cycle. You've got some organizations that are focused writ large on the direction of the party. I think American Crossroads is probably a good example of that, where we're kind of broadly supportive of Republicans at the federal level. I think the Republican Governors Association is often thought of as a party committee, but it's not. It's also a 527 organization that's dedicated to helping elect Republicans to the governorship. And then you've got groups that have more of an ideological bent. Club for Growth is a good example of that. They get involved in trying to elect Republicans, particularly in primaries, those who are far more conservative, especially on the economic issues. And then you've got single issue super PACs. There's a new one I think you all have started around immigration, and then as Charlie also mentioned, I think the latest innovation, and one that I think we're going to see a lot more of, are these candidate-specific super PACs. Now, by federal law, a candidate has to be independent from a super PAC that is founded to support him or her. They can't explicitly ask donors to give money in excess of the federal limit to a super PAC, and they can't coordinate their activities with the super PAC or vice versa. But I think in reality, this sort of activity is going to grow exponentially in the years ahead. You're starting to see it at the House level, starting to see it a little bit at the Senate level, but members are just too tantalizing to try to set up these things to advocate your own personal political future with your own super PAC. And again, it goes back to the issue that Charlie mentioned earlier, which is that this is, to some significant degree, created by Congress. The imposition of strict constraints on resources, particularly going into party committees, has ended up pushing all that money into these other channels. In the past, when I was at the Senatorial Committee in 1998 and 2000, we could accept unlimited contributions and we could engage in issue advocacy or independent expenditures. And all of the activity that we conducted, all the contributions we received, was disclosed. And we made the decisions about where to spend it, and the rules changed between 98 and 2000. In 98, we were not allowed to talk to campaigns about what we were doing. In 2000, we were. I can't tell you exactly why the rules changed, but they did. And actually, we didn't like the fact that we could talk to campaigns, because then they could tell us what to do, and we liked much better just to be able to do what we thought was right and would win an election. But again, I mean, when those limits came down, all it did was move it elsewhere, and so you now have, I think, what will be a greater proliferation in the future of very candidate-specific efforts. Our view, at least at Crossroads, I mean, we agnostic about these candidate-specific efforts, but our view is that it's helpful to have an organization that essentially represents the broader interests of the party, whether it's the Republican side or the Democratic side. And I think something that's relatively analogous, and I won't try to speak too much for Democrats, since we have good Democrats here to speak for themselves, but I think the House Majority PAC, the Senate Majority PAC were designed on the Democratic side to advance the goals of essentially almost functioning as an adjunct party committee, although independently from obviously Democratic candidates or the committees themselves.
So the operative word there is advance. How much of it is about defining the goals? So take on either, right? Is it about taking a set of principles stated by the Republican Party, in your case,
right,
and spreading them and encouraging them, or is there some effort on the part of the super PAC to help shape exactly what those goals ought to be and what the direction of the Republican Party ought to be?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. I mean, as I said, I mean, there are certain groups out there that have a very narrowly defined, or at least clearly defined, very specific ideological mission. And I mean, I think of several groups on the right, at least, where their mission is to advance a very particular set of ideological beliefs, and a lot of their work is done in primaries. They're actually much less interested in general elections. They're trying to elect a certain kind of Republican rather than another kind of Republican. And I don't know to what extent that goes on the Democratic side. I mean, I remember there was a period of time where the SEIU in particular was very focused on primary activity, and they were successful at different times in dislodging a Democratic incumbent in the House whom they viewed as insufficiently dedicated to what they wanted to see done. So that's one model. I think our model is broader. I mean, again, I think we're, if you look at what we do, the people we've supported, and we've supported very, very conservative candidates, and we've also supported much more moderate candidates. So, I mean, everyone from Sharon Angle to Mark Kirk, and I can't think of a broader spectrum than that. But the chief thing is they've been Republicans, and we wanted to see them get elected.
I think it's important to think of, although the title of this panel is Super PACs, to think more broadly of the outside universe of organizations, and whether that's some of the groups that you guys can talk about, obviously on the left, big ones like Emily's List or the unions, or on the right, whether it's the National Rifle Association or National Right to Life, or, I mean, you just saw in Illinois the Bloomberg Super PAC on a very specific issue make a huge impact in a Democratic primary on the guns issue.
I think that there's 2 points. It's a little bit, if you listen to this, I don't know how many folks up here are lawyers. I'm not one of them. It leaves you with a great fog about what's going on out there. So first, why don't I talk as a Democrat, and then maybe we should talk about what happens if you talk about it as being an American. The idea first that terrible things all happened, and that this was all formed on the Republican side as a reaction to unions having enormous power and clout within the country, it's a little bit of a stretch. It is true that a lot of what we're seeing in Citizens United could have been done and was done. I know I was looking at some of my notes. I know Colby College professor Anthony Corrado has pointed out, who's an expert on all of this, that it could have been done in 2008 and 2004. It is true that some of the attempts on McCain-Feingold and other things actually have diminished the power of parties. Stephen's correct, to control some of this, which is not a good thing, because frankly, I always call people who are independents hobgoblins of hysteria, that the idea that that's some sacred place to be. The weakening of parties has probably hurt us. But there might be some disagreement on the idea that all of these super PACs have formed as a reaction to the great power of unions in America. I might disagree with that slightly. But
we're all in politics, so we do a certain amount of coloring and spin.
Right. But I think the bigger issue is, if you really look at what's going on, is it's the Wild West. We're in bumper car land. That the truth of the matter is, whether there are super PACs that truly are guided by ideology, they don't have to be guided by anything. They are guided by people who form them, who can have any agenda. We now have a situation where people can write, whether the Republican donors happen to have been intimidated, in the past for whatever reasons, which I find slightly a stretch. We have a situation where people, look, Michael Bloomberg, you might agree with him on guns. He's worth $25 billion is his net worth. He can write a $100 million check and not blink an eye. And we now are in a situation, which is part of what's got to be discussed here, and there may not be a solution given the way the laws are frankly written, in which people can write checks of enormous amounts of money that have no impact on their lives but have a huge impact on yours. And that's where we are. And so we can talk about the purpose and the ideology of some of these super PACs, but basically they don't have to be guided by anything other than the fact that they have money and that they hire people like me. And my own view of this, frankly, is the only beneficiaries are TV stations and us. And maybe we're trying to save, and maybe we're trying to save the Postal Service, because there's a lot of mail going out too. But I do think you have to put this in perspective. And so the real question is, are we a good or bad thing? And is there anything that could be done to limit us? Certainly, and as Stephen can tell you, a hunk of the money that these folks spent, not 50%, but a hunk, we don't know who gave people money. And so certainly some of what I know Senator Schumer and others are trying to do, which is let's at least know where the money's coming from. We did talk a little beforehand. Unfortunately, I'm seeing in a lot of the polling that we look at that the voters don't care where the money came from. I mean, we were involved in a lot of races. Ohio, Sherrod Brown, $32 million was spent by outside groups attacking Sherrod Brown. And in a lot of the research that we saw, the voters didn't care. And that's probably not a positive thing for us. You would hope that somebody would care where and who was spending it. So there are some structural problems that we're going to have to get to about whether anything can be done or not. I happen to think it's probably unlikely, given a lot of what we see from the folks who, legally and the way the Supreme Court has ruled, and even if the Supreme Court, I think I agree with these folks, that Citizens United didn't change the landscape entirely. It has messed a little bit with the power of disclosure and some other things, but really we're in a situation where we're likely to see this grow in enormous leaps and bounds. This was just a testing ground, I think, for both Governor Romney and President Obama in terms of having independent expenditures go on their behalf, in effect. I think we're going to see this mushroom to far, far greater levels, and with all due respect to unions and the power of the internet, Sheldon Adelson has a lot more ability, who's a casino owner from Las Vegas, who really kept Newt Gingrich's campaign alive. Physically, one person kept somebody's campaign for the presidency of the United States alive. And so the real question, and I've grappled with this quite a bit, is what we can do about it, if anything, and what's the challenge to the system of this mushrooming.
So there's, again, just to sort of drill down a little on what everyone is explaining about how the process works. So if you think about it just in terms of the presidential race, there's, I think, broadly there are three levels. There's the candidate himself, then there's the candidate's campaign, and then there are outside groups that support the candidate, that support one side or the other. Most important thing, and I think it's also important it's tough because this is the first cycle in which it's been done really quite this way. So it's difficult to look back and draw conclusions yet about what the impact was. But I think that one thing that is unchanging is that the candidate is remain the most important thing in the race.
Yes.
I mean, the presidential race is where is the one race really where people aren't getting the majority of their information from advertising. There's such an intense focus on the candidates that they have a unique ability to convey to you who they are, what their vision is for for whatever office they're trying to gain or to keep. So the candidate matters. And then each candidate has a campaign, and campaigns matter immensely. I mean, it's hopefully worth getting into in our discussion. A good campaign makes a hell of a difference, and likewise a bad campaign can make a big difference in the outcome of the race. But the candidate remains at the top of the pyramid because a campaign rarely can do better than the candidate. And so, I think that the Obama campaign obviously did historic things, and they had an exceptional campaign. But they could have done all those things if they didn't have the president. They wouldn't have won. There wouldn't have been the same thing. And that's an overall thing. It's they ran ads, but they had ads with the president in them. I mean, you can try to create the best ads you can, but again, the candidate's the most important thing. If you took it down to like a tactical level, the Obama campaign had immense success in 2008 and 2012 with raising money with have dinner with Barack emails. So you could give a small amount, and even $5 would enter you to win, a spot at dinner with either the then candidate or in 2012 President Obama, which is a cool thing. Does not translate to every one of your campaigns. It's not necessarily a great thing. I've worked for plenty of candidates where, people would pay $5 not to have to watch them eat. Again, the candidate remains the most important thing, and the tactics the campaign use really, they can be really extra proficient, and that makes a huge difference. But they can't be much better than the candidate.
But as you go down the ladder of other campaigns, one, it's still we're in nascent stage. We don't know how much it's going to affect presidential elections.
Yeah.
We almost saw Romney lose some of the primaries when Santorum and others and people were coming in and doing independent expenditures. And certainly at the Senate and House level, it's going to make a much bigger difference because the megaphone of the campaign is not the equivalent of the president.
As I said, yeah, the presidency is unique in that if you're just talking about like the presidential race, it's unique in that it's the one spot where you're not getting most of your people know the candidates well by the end. No one is tuning in rec numbers to Senate, House, or State Assembly debates.
And yet hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by super PACs for the presidential race, and you're putting them at the third tier in terms of influence?
They are.
So why are people writing checks for large amounts of money?
First, I think because the system allows it. And second, because there are examples where it has an impact. I mean, again, the most important investment for folks is in the candidate, because no one is a better ambassador for the campaign, for the candidate, than his own campaign.
Yeah.
If this is why we didn't do field from organization, for example, if someone showed up at your door and said, I'm from Priorities USA Action and we are an independent group that supports that, that's not going to get you very far. But if someone shows up and says, I'm from Barack Obama's campaign, it makes a big difference. I mean, the candidate and the campaign is the best ambassador for the candidate and is the one who knows the candidate the best. And again, as I said, the focus is intensely on them. So they are the ones driving the narrative. They're the ones like deciding what the message is going to be from the campaign and what is going to be driving the news. So through the medium of the press. And something we all share is the letter of the law is for the outside groups. You're not allowed to, if you're going to be able to accept, if you're set up as a super PAC or a 501c4, you're allowed to accept certain amounts of money, and the trade-off is essentially you're not allowed to coordinate directly with the campaign on any activity regarding paid communication. So
what
basically
does that mean?
anything.
Right.
What are the boundaries of this is a really important thing, I think, to identify what counts as coordination and what not. So you can't speak directly, but you can
Anything you would
send
think
smoke signals to each
involves
other.
coordination is coordination.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
You can't say any idea that you didn't have on your own, or that is not based on research you've done yourself. The only place where the campaign and the independent group communicate legally is in the public domain. So once the campaign has aired an ad, you can see that ad and say, okay, this is what they want to talk about this week. And you can make a judgment based on what's already in the public domain. You can also, I mean, we did two things. We had two reports at the beginning of every day. One was who's on the air, with what, and where. So which campaigns, which outside groups are on the air, where are they airing them, which states, and what are they saying, what's the actual ad. The other thing we got was a digest of the public statements of the president, the vice president, and sort of key members of the administration or campaign team. And again, those are public statements. But that is, when you're talking about expending millions of dollars, and I'd be interested to hear what Stephen has to say about this in particular, that is pretty thin.
Yes.
That's not a lot, that's not a ton to go on. And so that is why I put the independent groups affirmatively in the third level.
Yeah, and one of the things I do want to pick up on another thing that Sean just said, because I think it's really important, but you know, one of the things that's it's like evolving battlefield doctrine is how campaigns and third-party groups interact. One of the things that we often play off of, and I'm sure you guys do too, is watching where the campaign is, if there's a candidate we hope to be supportive of, where are they placing their buys, how many points are they investing, what's the message, and then figure out how do we play against that. And in some Senate races, we were able to do that with a great deal of certainty because the campaign would buy a lot of time well in advance. And we just see, okay, they're going in these markets, they're going in all the Virginia markets except for the DC market because it's expensive. So that's where we need to fill in. And then we're seeing them run ads on this, so we need to try to echo that message. In 2012, it was made much more difficult at the presidential level because, for a variety of reasons, the Romney campaign did not buy TV time in advance. They would typically buy on a rolling basis. We laid in our TV buys, $45 million worth for the fall. We laid in that in on right after July 4th, because part of what we wanted to do is say, okay, here's our hand. Here's what we're able to do. Here are the holes that we can't fill in.
That bears repeating, though. So what he's saying is, so they bought their TV time, because what you do with your ads is you buy time on the at the various stations in the various states and various markets, and that's when your ads air. So in July, they said, okay, here's what we're going to buy this time in October and September, and that's another thing that's public. Everyone can see that. It's a matter of public information. Right. It's something they did that is hard to read. You did it, they didn't.
Right. We wanted to sort of try to provide some, not strategic direction at all, but really just at least lay out our hand. And then as it got into the fall, we would approach each week, and this is getting a little technical, but I think it's useful and important. As we approached each week, we would look at what the Obama campaign was buying. We would look at what Sean and company were buying, and then we'd look at what Romney was buying. And very typically, between President Obama and Sean, they were buying somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 gross rating points in a given week. And for those of you who don't know that, that's just a gigantic amount. That's just wall-to-wall advertising. And the Romney campaign had placed literally nothing. And so very frequently we would add into our buys what additional money we could cobble together, just because we had no real sense for the sort of kind of tactically how things would unfold. But typically you can get a sense for where campaigns are going. Sometimes they'll very publicly say, these are the things I want to talk about, and then you get a little bit better sense of what you can play against. But just very briefly, I want to just follow up on one important point that Sean made that's a little bit more of a global point, which is the significance and the importance of the candidate. I mean, I think there's a lot of focus on outside groups such as all of ours, and what is instantly of interest is the money, because it's sort of a lurid thing, and it's particularly lurid for all of us who wish we had more of it. But it is really important to understand how central the candidate remains in politics. What I find very frequently the role of groups like ours is, particularly at the Senate level, is to try to make campaigns against incumbents competitive. If you have a typical race between an incumbent and a challenger, I remember in law school, I was in law school, and I had my first year professor was a professor of civil procedure, and he said, what's the problem with the civil justice procedure, the civil justice system in America today? And of course we didn't know, and he said, the problem is if they hire me, they win. And if they hire you, they lose. And if you're an incumbent versus a challenger, typically the incumbent wins, because the incumbent who's based in Washington has ready access to a huge amount of political action committee money, all of whom are interested in his or her committee positions and votes and things like that, and they can just walk around town. They never have to go home, and they can build gigantic war chests that put almost any challenger, unless they're a self-funder, at a disadvantage. I went and looked at our investments in Senate races in 10 and 12, and the vast majority of what we invested in was behind challengers to try to make those races competitive. Incidentally, that's very similar to what a party committee would do and would have done back when they had more resources. But in the end, we can make those races competitive. The one thing that we cannot do in the end is to close the sale for the candidate. Only the candidate can do that, especially in Senate races, when voters sooner or later get to figure out who of these wonderful human beings they get to choose between on Election Day.
Yeah, but the one thing I would just, if you look, and the self-funder is important, but if you look at the history of Senate races, the most important factor in whether an incumbent is vulnerable is whether the challenger has sufficient resources. So there is a direct correlation between winning and losing of whether somebody has enough money. But we're just at the beginning stages here. And I think that the idea, first of all, I've had a lot of candidates who probably hurt me more than helped me. And so, I always said about some people, boy, the more people they meet, the worse we are. And so, just like in life, there's people that, but the bottom line is that we're just at the beginning stages of this, And I don't know if we can agree that, these are campaign, I think at the presidential level, it's an entirely different ballgame, and we can talk about, we always view our role as you have to make some direct choice. Are you amplifying what the campaign is doing, or are you supplementing it? Are you doing something different to take a piece of the turf? We chose Bain, for example, in what we chose to do for priorities. But I really think at the Senate and the House level, we're about to see an explosion of money that is going to be greater than what we've seen in the past. I think people have now just gotten a sense of what can happen. And I think the candidate is going to be diminished. And yes, of course, it's great to have a good candidate, but I think we're going to see over time that these outside expenditures, when done well, and we're all going to learn how to do them better, frankly, unfortunately. We're going to get better at what we're doing. I think that they're going to have more to say, and unfortunately candidates are going to have less to say as time goes on. And I don't see much way that we get around that, but I think unfortunately we're going to see the balance change.
Well, candidates, there's no doubt candidates are very important, but under any system, candidates are important. I think Stephen made an important point from a sort of a political science perspective of, if you go back to the genesis, if you buy that the genesis of the system we're in is McCain-Feingold, that was Congress, which doesn't like, remember, they're all incumbents. They're in office already. They don't like people running against them having resources. And they want to be protected, so they tried to strangle money going to challengers. And now you're in a world where, if you're an incumbent, you have name identification advantage, and you can go around Washington, D.C. picking up PAC checks. But if you're challenging an incumbent now, you might have a super PAC supporting you that could have a few well-financed individuals, or could have the whole union supporting it. I mean, whoever it is, I think it's indisputable that super PACs are having the effect of leveling the playing field. You saw that in the presidential race, the example about Newt Gingrich's super PAC. He was going up against a much better financed and much better organized campaign, Mitt Romney, but he was able to stay in the race in that presidential primary because he did have a super PAC supporting him. And I think as you go into the next election cycle, you're going to see a lot more super PACs that are candidate specific, and it may end up having a good political science, sort of global perspective benefit of making races more competitive and taking away a little bit of the advantage of incumbency. Now, if I can argue against myself, I would say that we've seen a amazing new perspective on this whole thing, which is, you've probably all seen there's this new 501c4 organization set up to, Organizing for America, set up to support President Obama. And what they've said in their donor materials is that if you give $500,000 to that, you get quarterly meetings with the president. So that's a way to sort of twist the whole incumbency advantage back. You've got the power of the presidency being used to bring in $500,000 potentially confidential donations for people that get private meetings or group meetings with the president for their contributions. That could be an incredibly effective fundraising tactic, and then go back to tilting towards incumbent protection.
Is there any reason to believe that either in this last election cycle or going further, that there's going to be tensions that we're going to observe between the super PACs and the campaigns? That is, what issues are going to be emphasized and how they're going to be talked about? That somebody who writes a big check for a super PAC and then sees their candidate not performing as well as they'd like, and decides this person needs to be talking about something different from what. Thus far, we've presented the super PACs as providing support, right? Sort of this, and mimicking the campaign. But might there not be, why wouldn't there be important tensions that are going to arise between the direction of a campaign that would like to go, where it would like to go on its own free will, and where the super PACs are trying to nudge it?
I think there's inherent on both sides. One, your funders, I always tell folks that if I didn't want to be in a profession where people told me what they thought, I would have picked brain surgery. Who walks in the middle of the operation, tells you go a little right to left. I can tell you that this guy, the number of calls that you get from funders, I really am not at liberty to explain exactly some of the ideas that they shared with us, but they're from Mars.
No, please do.
and so one, you have tension.
I can invite you back.
I got off one call. Called afterwards. I said, I will not be making that ad. But so one, you have tension from your own funders, who, somebody writing $100 million would like to know what it's being used for, and has strong opinions. Their wives have strong opinions. Their cousins have strong opinions. And then you certainly are going to have tension with campaigns. I mean, there are plenty of times where we judge what somebody's doing. I know we did Tammy Baldwin's race in Wisconsin, and one of the super PACs did an ad that I thought was supposedly it was for us on our side, that was costing us votes. And you're like, they're costing us votes. They've got some baby crying, whatever it was, or something ridiculous, I thought. And so you're going to have tension at times, because not only are you worried that people aren't spending their money in a way that's really helping your campaign, there are times they're doing stuff that's just wacky or wrong that you think's hurting you, and you don't have any control. So I think you're going to see...
The law, that's what the law mandates, basically.
Yep. Can you guys answer sort of a real world example? Is in the presidential race, you had your super PAC running ads basically accusing Mitt Romney of killing somebody.
I had a bet of how long it would take for you to bring that up.
Well, no, I think it goes to this question.
Let me just answer that first, because first I want to defend the fellow whose interview we did, Joe Sopcich from Kansas City. There are always unintended consequences when you run an ad, that it's interpreted in a way. You're welcome to have shared that interpretation. Here's a guy who lost his job because of the plant closing. In his head, that, yes, it was 5 years later when his wife died of cancer. In his head, working guy, he wound up getting a job after that for half his salary as a janitor. And he believed, after all of that happened, that, you know what, yes, my wife had health insurance for a while, and she left her job. But geez, if I had still had that job, I would have had health insurance for both of us. She wouldn't have waited till she was at the level of cancer stage that she was before she went to a doctor. The way it was interpreted by the press and by other folks was that we had put on somebody who accused Mitt Romney of killing her. I regret that, because that's not what Joe meant. But in the game of politics, something was interpreted that way. So what I always say about that ad, because obviously it only ran on the internet, shows you a little bit what happens when you put it on the internet before we put it on the air, that we did 13 or 14 ads with real people. That was one that caused, obviously, I know my kids, the only thing about that is they wound up making a Saturday Night Live parody, so it helped with my children.
That's cool.
View of me. It helped me and my family. But the one thing I want to point out, and I always say about that, is I just want to defend Joe Sopcich. What I want to defend is the guy, that is clearly not what he intended. That is not what he meant. That was in his head. But hey, sometimes we had a responsibility to think about what other people might have thought about it. And sure, I look back upon that and think about that. But that is not what Joe meant. And I'd always want to stand up for him.
To the question, like our first, there was really only one sort of written rule, and that was the one that Saul wrote for us at the beginning of the effort, which is first, do no harm. And it's you can't. What is the celebration over something like that that doesn't happen? I mean, there are any number of instances in which both sides probably have something that in the can that they don't end up using, which is that's a difficult decision on a campaign, is what do you not use because you think it might cause furor. But that, again, like to your question, that's a very difficult tension, and the law mandates that tension, or the law doesn't allow for anything but tension. So you don't know when you, the idea is not to do harm for whatever, if it's someone misinterpreting it, having their own story on it, someone interpreting it accurately, someone talking about it. What you have to judge is what is happening in real time, in the real world, through the filter of the press, through the filter of the campaigns, and you have to make a decision.
And if I would have wanted to accuse Governor Romney of murder, I would have been much more explicit, frankly, because I'm not, but no, we watch the campaign, have to deal with it, including the President of the United States being asked that question, and that kind of violated you don't want to do anything to the campaign that causes them any difficulty. Obviously, some of the other ads, including an ad we did where a guy claimed that what he had been asked to do was the equivalent of building his own coffin when he had been asked to build the stage from which he was fired, had a different reaction, as well. But it
was tremendously impactful.
Yeah, and I actually wasn't trying to take a shot with that. I was getting to, I wonder, you probably know by now, was the president, and when they did had to answer for that, was it sort of crocodile tears? Were they happy that you were doing it?
I don't know.
Well,
I don't know. All I can
we're
tell you
examining it in a vacuum then, because at almost the same exact time,
Right.
there was an ad that misrepresented his what he had done on Medicare. So that's it. We're examining this all in a vacuum.
Right.
It's difficult to take any of these, in a vacuum and take them out of the.
I don't know about the. I don't know. I mean, I know it had 1 million hits on YouTube, and so I don't know. At that point, which is one of the dangers. You're putting everything into the bloodstream. But like I said, on that, the only sensitive thing I feel about that is just standing up for Joe. I went to these communities in Indiana and to Kansas City and saw these people's homes and spent time in their living rooms and talked to them. And so we tried to represent them honestly. But again, there's always a danger.
But the goal is not, the goal is never to have the president have an answer a question about.
But I think the larger conclusion is to get into politics, you have to have steel intestines, because part of anything in campaigns, whether you're on this side of it or the campaign side of it, is typically there has to be an edge with which to engage, and there have been all sorts of ads throughout the history that have backfired. I remember one particular that came to mind when I saw that one, where we filmed an opponent in Kentucky who was banging a lectern, and we played Flight of the Valkyrie behind it, and people accused us of comparing to Hitler, which we really didn't intend to do, but it was that same sort of thing. You get one article written that says, oh, here's what it is, and then it takes on a life of its own, and you're dealing with that. But it is true, it is a larger matter of doctrine. What Sean just said, I think, is really a significant issue, which is that when you're, I think that the responsible place to be, if you're an independent group but you're trying to help advance somebody or some group of candidates, you don't want to be on the bleeding edge. You don't want to be the center of the controversy, because typically that's just not. Let the campaign, let the candidate make those kinds of judgments, and so it isn't quite as often that you see those kind of real tough ads. And on the other hand, I thought some of the priorities ads really had an appropriate level of edge. Given what they were intended to do. I'm not saying they were fair, but they connected because they took a risk, and we all do that to some extent, and every once in a while it flares up in a way you don't expect.
So I want us to be able to open it up to all of you, and so there's a microphone at the back where we can begin taking questions. And while people move back, I'll ask one last question, which is how do we think about issues of attribution? That is, if you characterize this scene as the Wild West, and from the viewpoint of voters, it's sort of the Wild West viewed through glasses that are shattered, right? Trying to make sense of it. And so when these different messages are being handed down, and you don't know who it is that's saying it.
But here's how sad the situation is. One, even in the focus groups, and actually I feel part of this because we did the law first in North Carolina a long time ago, for the candidate, when he's on or she's on, saying, I paid for this ad. In the focus groups, what they say is, why is that? They don't even get a sense that that's a public service. They think that the candidate is being ridiculous. And they go, who is he or who is she trying to get me to vote for them by telling me that they paid for it? So they actually, even on the positive ads and the negative ads that they have to pay for, are somewhat insulted by the disclaimer. So that's number one. Number two, we did Michael Bennett's race in Colorado. It was the place where, with all due respect, we mentioned who we mentioned who was doing the ads against us, and we had some research that indicated that saying, "Hey, it's Karl Rove spending this money against you." In a lot of the campaigns that we saw in this last cycle, it didn't matter to them. And so it's a very tough call, and that's going to be one of the things that happen now over time. Does it matter that somebody, who is the perpetrator, so to speak, and does it matter? And we're finding more and more, at least and maybe it's the nature of the states, but clearly in Ohio, we were very disappointed, given that we were being outspent by that kind of money on the outside money, again, more than any other state by far in the country, we had hoped that saying who spent the money mattered, and guess what? They didn't care.
I think one area it does matter, though, is with the press. I think with Priorities USA, you were seen as the Obama team. And I think with Restore Our Future, what we did was, to a large extent, attributed as sort of the Romney team. And I think if you're in a candidate-specific group, you're held to a higher standard and have a higher chance of it backfiring than a group like a Union or Crossroads.
So let's open it to the floor. If we could, there's a lot of interest, which is great. If you could just state briefly who you are and then get right to the question, we'll hopefully be able to have a lot of people weigh in. Please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Yang Cheng, PhD candidate in physics. I remember last year, almost a year ago, during one of the inaugural events at Institute of Politics, where Mr. David Gregory moderated a panel, and they were kind of projecting the impact of super PACs during this election cycle. And Mr. Steve Schmidt said that he feels sometime during the summer there will be a Romney supporting super PAC that is going to do something so outrageous that it's going to fundamentally hurt the candidate. Well, now it's past the election, and it seems like it does not happen. But on the other hand, we also saw the proliferation of super PACs did indeed prolong the primary process, which may not be a benefit to Governor Romney. So in retrospect, what is the net impact of super PACs on both sides of the presidential race? And has what Mr. Schmidt projected happened to any other candidates at like state or local levels? Thank you.
Thank God Steve was wrong. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting question in terms of the impact during the primaries. I mean, if Mitt Romney wouldn't have been the nominee without, my opinion is Mitt Romney would not have been the nominee without Restore Our Future. So without his super PAC, he would not have been able to be the nominee. And you made a really interesting point about how the process was prolonged, because there's a certain degree to which it's not always an apples to apples comparison, because it's not the same exact process for the incumbent as it is for the challenger. And oftentimes what you see is, I think, an sort of inverse relationship between what benefits the campaign and what necessarily benefits the super PAC. So for writ large for Team Obama and the Democratic effort for president, prolonging the primary past South Carolina is ostensibly a good thing. Take them that much longer to have a unified nominee, take the nominee that much longer to transition from primary candidate to general candidate, which is the most difficult thing to do in politics. So great, this is great. Like, this food fight's going to keep going, and it's terrific. I don't know if you remember our conference call from that night. Not such a great thing for us. I mean, the inherent advantage the challenger has with a super PAC is and the candidates, in fact, there is always one target, the incumbent, and that just doesn't change. It's a unified opponent. It's someone everyone's gunning for. For me, up until the point at which Romney was really the presumptive nominee, it was always arguing, something's going to happen, I swear, just wait. Like, this is going to happen. And it's difficult to appreciate, I think, what a good job the Romney campaign and Restore did during the primaries. Maybe is something that's underappreciated. It wasn't something that was underappreciated by us. What we thought was they're doing a terrific job now. Everyone thinks they're fighting for their lives and it's going to be like a weakened candidate. But what's really going to happen is he's going to come out the other side, and they're going to have resources, and he'll be an efficient candidate. So it's interesting that you bring up that point, because it really is like kind of an inverse thing. I mean, there were probably cartwheels on the other side after South Carolina, not as much for us.
Please.
Yeah, my name is Jay Mulberry. I'm more interested in the shape of things to come, and I'm wondering if an example, maybe it isn't, but at least it's suggestive of that is the 2nd district election, or primary election that recently took place. In that case, I think somebody can correct me, but if I'm wrong, it still makes a general point, that Robin Kelly was elected because of Bloomberg, primarily, and his $125 million. I don't think that that is a good example of the idea that a candidate stands out. I don't really think she stood out. I think Bloomberg could have put his money on somebody else, and that other person would win. Because I don't think that there was that much of a distinction. Now, the other thing is, I'm not sure, I'm sure Robin Kelly, is just being in Chicago and all that, I'm sure she takes a position in favor of gun control. There's no doubt about that. But I'm not sure that she took as much of a position on gun control as she's going to have to take now that her money has come in $125 million on the basis of her position on gun control. In other words, I'm suggesting, and I don't mean to keep it at Robin Kelly, I'm suggesting that the super PACs can choose the candidate and they can make the candidates positions, or at least shift them farther in some direction than they would have been otherwise.
And I think, back to Saul's point, it's a different, it is a different level of impact as you get down the ballot. I'm not sure that the Robin Kelly example is actually tantamount to what. Yeah, I think your point is well made that there's we need to account for the fact that in a low information, short sprint election, that anyone who decides they're going to put in that much money is effectively choosing the candidate. Now, in this election, he was deciding who he did not want the candidate to be. He did not want it to be Debbie Halverson. She had an A+ rating from the NRA. Debbie lost by 27%. I'm not certain that I'm not certain it would have been a different outcome otherwise. So I'm not sure that that specific example really makes the case. But I think it's a point well taken. I think that and it's something that's worth examining. But again, I'm not sure how much again, in this specific way, this is still a pretty new process, so it's tough to say.
Yeah, especially further down ballot, very short election time frame, not a lot of time to think about it. You do magnify the impact of outside support, but that's sort of an unusual setting. I mean, in the Massachusetts Senate special, where Scott Brown ended up winning, there was a fair amount of outside support, but there was outside support on both sides. But in the end, it was the candidates who were most vivid to people, even again in a fairly short time frame.
But I think it's important to note that, given I have a little involvement in that race, we'll see if you do. The Republican candidates who are running right now for John Kerry's seat, none of them have signed the pledge. Elizabeth Warren and Scott Brown signed a historic pledge to have us kicked out, except for mail. And they held to it, that there were penalties that individual campaigns agreed to. In what's going on right now, the Republican candidates there have refused to sign. If that's not a signal to this fella, I don't know what is. So campaigns have the ability to limit this. That's really, when Russ Feingold apparently went into stations in Wisconsin and demanded ads be taken off the air. And so there is something to be said for there are times, we saw it happen once, where candidates themselves, I actually was on the other side of opinion of that. I actually thought that it was it would have been better for Scott Brown to have the outside money. A lot of people think it would have been better for Elizabeth Warren. I actually thought it would have been better for Scott Brown, but that was debatable. And the point is that they both stopped the money from coming. So there is some way that people can diminish this. By the same token, look, there are some times that whether you agree or disagree with their ideology, that some of the stuff they're doing is good. Some of what's going on with some of the folks that Steve's associated with are trying to find, candidates on their side of the aisle that not only do they think have a better chance of winning, but by the nature of that process probably have more of a chance of being in Washington and trying to get something done compared to what we're seeing now, which is kind of nobody's doing anything about some of the long-term problems that matter. And so sometimes good comes out of this. The danger is that the system has no accountability in and of itself.
But your point is really needs to be like the guiding principle, which is who is making how far is the decision taken out of the voters' hands, and it's something that bears having a lot of erring.
But remember, again, super PACs aren't acting in a vacuum. If Bloomberg hadn't come into that congressional primary, then very likely whoever the unions endorsed would have been, in a short time period, the Democratic standard bearer. And to the same extent that the winner might be beholden to Bloomberg's views on guns, if it had been public employee unions that had carried the Democratic candidate over the finish line, I'm confident they'd be reminding her of that too.
I wish these unions had as much money as
I was going to say, yeah.
I'd be doing a lot better.
The problem is they always say they spend more than they do. That's the problem.
Please.
My name is Don Lamb, and this is a question I'd be grateful if both the Republican side and the Democratic side weighed in on. We've heard, and we kind of know that in the candidates' campaigns, they plan out a whole series of ads with an arc to them extending over the entire campaign. Of course, they're driven away from that from time to time to have to respond, but they try to, even in their responses, to keep that going. Super PACs are in a completely different situation. It was mentioned trying to fill holes, trying to complement or add on to it. Do the large super PACs involved, for example, in the presidential race, have that kind of overarching plan, or is it always sort of more or less a rapid response team to try to fill in the gaps or complement?
Can I start with a compliment, which is I think these guys did a fantastic job of having an overarching theme. A little bit grotesquely dishonest, but still, they did a great job of.
But obscenely strategic.
Yes,
Right.
It worked very well, and that's the best example you could come up with, I think.
Yeah, maybe I'll just throw in one quick thing, and then maybe you guys want to comment on it too. It's a little bit of both. I mean, one of the things, though, that I think outside groups aren't. Let's step back a little bit further. The idea that I was talking about earlier, where we're trying to play off against what campaigns are doing, doesn't suggest that it's necessarily ad hoc. And in fact, I think outside groups are not as well positioned to engage in the parry and thrust of the campaign. One of the internal debates that we had was whether we should get deeply involved in trying to defend against some of the attacks being leveled against Romney in the summer, and we ended up running one particular ad that countered some of the outsourcing charges. But it's hard to get into that game because we aren't the candidate. We don't have the candidate speaking to camera. We don't have facts that would be uniquely at the disposal of the candidate. And so typically what we aim to do too, and as Charlie indicated, what we really saw with priorities especially is try to have a sense for what our contribution is going to be overall. And for us, at least, as we looked at the campaign, at least prior to the primary, we had done a lot of research on a lot of public opinion research and focus groups on President Obama. And one of the things that we found was that the people who had voted for him in 2008, even if they were disappointed in him, even if he hadn't been everything that they had hoped, they still kind of liked him. They still were inclined to think the best of him. They were inclined, maddeningly to us, to excuse almost anything that one might say was something that had gone wrong during his administration. And what we found was the only thing that would take an Obama 2008 voter, swing independent voter, and convert them to start thinking about voting for Romney was if you could persuade them that the policies that Obama had championed were, from thinking that they were helping the economy, convert them to thinking that they were hurting the economy. And so if you look at virtually everything that we did during that summer period and Americans for Prosperity and others were also in there. It was basically that message. They were not hard-hitting ads. They were, in fact, if you hear, donor input, donors would say, these ads are just so soft. What's going on with that? But we said, look, you go to the nth degree and say he's, a liberal, guy who wants to change America in a horrible way, it would just float in and out of their mind. And so we did do a fair amount of thinking about what we're going to do, and really over a long period of time tried to execute that particular strategy. And you guys just tore the bark off them, as far as I could tell.
And we also had, there is a difference between another sort of apples to oranges comparison is that there were probably more groups that, to a greater degree on Romney's side in the presidential than there were on President Obama's side, and on the whole, more money on the outside. And I'm not speaking to I'm not even commenting on what the I'm not making a judgment on that in particular. Just to the point of like that, the tactics and what the impact is. It's if you have your strategy sometimes matches your level of resources, or else you'll perish. I mean, if you have a finite amount of resources and finite amount of time, it's necessary for you to be strategic and do one thing. So we're entitled to, I think, some credit for making that decision, but we didn't have the ability to do a bunch of different things. We just we'd made that judgment and decided to focus.
And in commenting on, Stephen's, comment about not defending Romney, it's really dangerous for us, even if we don't have the candidate, for any of us to get into the business of suddenly defending the campaign when the campaign isn't defending itself. Where David Axel and I became friends, we both did the IE for the DNC for Kerry, and the campaign was not responding to the Swift boats. And we did an ad, and he did an ad. The two firms, we were like, well, let's go with your ad. He went and filmed General McPeak in Oregon. And so as soon as the campaign indicated that they were willing to respond, we put General McPeak on. But that was 2-3 weeks afterwards. But you really, in what we're doing, particularly at the presidential level, these guys to have chosen to defend Romney when Romney wasn't choosing to defend himself, that's the whole point of do no harm, that you're really starting to get into territory where the campaign is no longer making the major decision of the campaign, and that's not really our responsibility if we're doing what we're supposed to do. And so those are the tough calls, even when you think somebody is hurting themselves by not responding. We were, I think, pretty surprised that on the Bain stuff, given what he had done at Staples, given his record in business. Look, he always had an advantage on jobs in the economy. All we were trying to do was keep it within limits and not have it overwhelm the vote. But we were pretty surprised that he never chose to defend all that stuff. So I don't know why they made a decision not to.
Hi, my name's Eric Wesson. I'm a third-year undergraduate political science major. Earlier in the speaker series, people from Sergio Ben-Dixon and Larry Grisolano on the Obama side to Ashley O'Connor and to a lesser extent Beth Myers on the Republican side commented on the impact the early advertising had not only on the election in general, but also specifically in the Hispanic American market. And I was wondering whether any of the super PACs have started thinking about making Spanish language or other language advertisements or advertisements on Univision, etc., in order to try to appeal to that market, maybe on the Republican side, staunch the bleeding before Romney got involved in late August, at which point there'd already been a couple months of ads, or on the Democrat side to augment the message that Obama was trying to send. Thank you.
We both did. I mean, there was we made an effort on that because it's one of the tactically, it's one of the places you can have a real impact. And I mean, the more you can, in general, the more you can target your message, the better. I mean, if you're so targeted that you're doing it in a specific language to specific voters, it's about as targeted as you can get. I mean, we did that, and you guys did. I mean, did a Spanish ad before, Hispanic ad?
We did a couple of Spanish language ads. One a little bit earlier on just specifically in the Las Vegas market, and then national ad on immigration and the president's past positions on immigration before the DREAM Act executive order. But we also did a fair amount of research with Hispanic voters, and one of the things we found was that the audience that watches almost exclusively Spanish language TV, there were maybe 7 or 8% that were persuadable to Romney, whereas Hispanics, where there was a higher persuadable population, largely watched English language programming. So we ended up doing a lot more. We did things that were aimed at an Hispanic audience on English language TV. We did a little bit on Hispanic, but on Spanish language, but not as much as you might think, just because our sense was that the votes simply weren't even there.
If there's one overarching lesson that I took from this cycle, it's that the timing of money is as important or more important than the overall amounts. So while you saw, we can say there were $2 billion campaigns all in on each side. That is true, but the Obama team had their money much earlier in the cycle. If at Restore Our Future, we could have taken $20 million of money that we spent in Ohio in the closing weeks when there are already 10,000 points of TV on, and instead spent them on Hispanic targeted advertisements in Florida and Nevada in June, in July, and all the way through the election, that might have made a huge impact. But we didn't have the resources then. We got it at the end, and the Romney campaign, as I'm sure they talked about, was cash poor all the way through the convention and didn't have the time to build the investments and the outreach plan that the Obama campaign did so effectively. But that's part of the advantage of being an incumbent.
And just to show you the level, because you guys live in Illinois, so you wouldn't have seen all of this.
That's right.
In Ohio, because these people were getting literally, so you remember who you're putting into focus groups. It's why Alexander Hamilton wanted to limit the franchise, with all due respect. You are putting people in who don't, why are they there? Are they undecided because they have a lot of information? They're actually undecided because they care a lot more about going to their kid's softball game, which is, what they should be doing a lot of times. And they literally were saying to us that they were getting 8 calls a day at their house from politics. They'd pick up the phone. So at their house, beyond the fact that you're getting, it could be, I don't know how many ads per day, could be, 5,000 points a day. So they were like not answering their phones, or they were going, these people are driving me crazy. So it creates this atmosphere. Not only are they seeing a lot of it, they're angry when they're seeing anything and getting any calls. And to be in one of these states, it's why, me personally, I'd like to see the popular vote for president be the vote. I think, the idea that you guys don't count and Ohio counts kind of doesn't make much sense. But literally, when you go into one of these states where we're on, the campaigns are on, all the IEs are on, there are, in a contested Senate race going on the same time, congressional races, it's really overwhelming what these people are bombarded with.
We have time for one last question from the floor.
Hi, my name is Asil Ahmad. I'm the spouse of a graduate student here. I really appreciate the sort of frankness and joviality of the panel. I didn't expect it to be quite as congenial, so I applaud you guys for for not strangling each other on the stage. Maybe backstage you'll do that. My question
They
is...
held it in October.
Right. My question is about the, looking to the future. The super PAC scenario emerged sort of mid-stride in this cycle, and so there really wasn't a lot of time for you guys to raise money and then come up with strategy and do all the things that you might do had you had enough lead time to plan out a strategy. Now that the campaigns of 2012 are done, people have moved out of those campaigns, all the thinking and strategizing and the technology and everything that's coming out into the private sector, I think these are skills and talents that are up for grabs. And if I was an investor that was ready to put in $50, $100, maybe $250 million, the spend in 2016 will probably be, for the presidentials alone, $1.5, $2 billion, maybe more. I'm not going to make an investment of that amount of money unless I felt like I was going to get a better return than I may have in 2012. So, I think it's a real serious question. What types of tactics can the the super PACs and will the super PACs adopt to essentially create campaigns? I mean, if I was planning to run for the Republican nomination now, I would be thinking, let me find a super PAC donor, let me start establishing a grassroots organization that has credibility, that has roots in battleground states, and really essentially engineer elections out of the money that will never really get reported until months or how many months after the fact. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts from both sides about the sophistication that can actually come into super PACs beyond just mail and TV ads, which are kind of going out the door, and technology, social media, building these sort of immense databases that can find people where they are, how they are, when they are, and try to influence them.
And door to door, yeah. Well, I think there's a little bit of the potential of a full circle, though, on, again, we're just in the end of February 2013 here, so it's difficult to draw hard conclusions based on the first cycle of which there's really been this type of activity on the presidential level. But I think I don't think it's a stretch to say that to some degree the just sort of cacophony of ads and the intense media focus and the diffusion of the media potentially is making the contact at the door the most important thing again. So that's just on sort of like the continuum. With regard to the what you can do when, I mean, it's a sort of constant struggle to say. I mean, the point was made that when you have the money makes such a big difference. Very difficult case to make. You really have to have specifics. But at the end of the day, as much as the campaigns are getting longer and longer, which is really a problem for governing, it's still nothing. Nothing kicks up the level of activity like proximity to the actual election and the presence of a real threat. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing almost. It's like if I was trying to raise money for a super PAC for a 2016 candidate, if there was a Republican super PAC organizing and executing right now to take on the candidate I'm supporting, that's one piece of information that will make it much easier for me to find early investors. But barring that, it's unlikely that any of us are going to go on the air in the next couple of months against the candidate for president in 2016. If I could tip my hand. But again, like I think there's a certain amount you can do. Like what everyone's realizing is like the earlier you get them. We just have really the 1 or 2 cycles to base this on. It's a very difficult hill to climb with donors to make the case early.
So we're
all trying.
Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, look, it's really good for my family and bad for yours, is how I look at this. So I really, I'm not, there's no way to fix this, frankly, given it's not just, I agree with these guys, it's not Citizens United alone. Like I said, it would be great to know more of where your money came from. But that isn't the crux of it. Really, it existed, before the Citizens United stuff. Look, I think what Stephen said in the beginning, which is we're going to see candidates have their own super PACs, is going to manifest, and I actually think the early money is going to come. I think he's absolutely right. Just so you're clear about what the law allows, in effect, if you want to run for president or you want to run for Senate, and somebody who's really close to you, known as your best friend, basically says, I'm not going to, by the way, I won't be able to talk to you for a while about anything other than our families, and you're actually allowed to give that person a list, because I mean, you should talk to these 100 people, and you go to those 100 people and you ask them for $10 million each, whether it's to do internet stuff or whether it's to form anything, or you're running for the Senate and you know that there are 25 very wealthy people who will write a $10 million check to your Senate campaign if the right person asks them, who they trust has, your interests at heart. We're going to see these things start to develop, I think, for individual candidates at a much greater level than what we've seen so far.
So to wrap up, that's a great place to end, but I'm going to put you all on the spot.
Can I just put one quick thing on that too? I just first of all, I just want to clarify: do you have $100 or $250 million? Otherwise, we'll talk at the end. Well, you'll be talking to one of us anyway.
We could do it together for that much.
Exactly right. Yeah, I know exactly.
Point is, don't give it to the campaign.
Right. They'll just waste it. Just two very quick things when you mentioned about the future. I mean, one is, as Sean has said, and it's very true. I mean, we're really in an evolving environment, and one of the things that I think not only outside groups like us are adapting to, but I think campaigns really have to adapt to, is that this is a new form of three-dimensional chess. And one of the things that I always sensed about the Romney effort was that they were really kind of running their own thing, which obviously they have their right to do, and if I were in their shoes, I would want to do as well. But where we have found that outside groups can have the most impact is when a candidate is very aware of the three-dimensional chess surroundings. And just one brief example of that was in the Missouri Senate race in 2010, when Roy Blunt, the Republican, was running against a woman named Robin Carnahan, who launched a ferocious campaign. I mean,
I was the loser there.
It was an excellent campaign.
Oh, thank you.
It was, and we saw these ads that you'd ordinarily see in late October, just punching Roy Blunt, and so we decided, again, as Saul said, it's not a good position to be in, typically defending the incumbent. We would just go after Robin Carnahan, and what Roy Blunt did is he noticed that, and so he put himself in the position more of a defensive and self-rehabilitation posture. It was a very aware sort of activity that, and only the candidate can make that decision to do that. So that's one, I think, thing that I think is going to develop and change. And I'll just be very quick about this because I know you want to wrap up. But the other thing that I think that we all learned from watching the Obama campaign, and by the way, I think the Obama campaign was one of the great political campaigns in modern history, and that we'll all be looking at for a while. But one of the things that they did was they used advances in data, most of which was not tremendously radical. I mean, some of the things they did were quite innovative, but for the most part, they just made a decision to use data very effectively to do niche plays. So that, for example, they realized that if they could turn out a larger segment of unmarried women, that's typically a Democratic voting bloc. And they could, if they changed the composition of that vote overall, the women's vote would go more for President Obama. And they were successful at that. And they were able to turn out unmarried women at a higher level than their enthusiasm level. And they did that with other little segments of the electorate. And I think what you're going to see more of, especially with outside groups, where we don't always necessarily have all the resources we want, focusing on niche plays, looking for the unique thing to do that creates value for the candidate or the cause or whatever you're doing, rather than trying to cover the waterfront and act as if you were the candidate. But all the other things we're going to do differently, I'm not going to.
One last axiom. It's harder to make a good positive ad than a good negative ad.
Yes, and that's true.
I think, hopefully we spend a bunch of our time doing stuff like that too. So hope.
Sounds like a good place to end. Thank you all for joining us and for the great questions.